We stay with us and speak to Dr. Kingsley Makhubela, risk analyst and former diplomat, as well as Dr. Cilliers, board chair and head of African Futures and Innovation at the Institute for Security Studies, who will be joining us online. We also have here in studio SABC News International editor Sophie Mokoena. Thank you so much to you all for your time. I'm going to start with just, if we can, just take a graphic that looks at the casualties, especially when it seems, you know, where to just to get a sense of where we are now, especially when you look at what exactly is going on there. You then are looking at a mission, right, that has seen fatalities, 9 soldiers, you know, dying on the 23rd, 24th, 4 soldiers, 27th of Jan, 3 soldiers, 23rd and the 24th of January. I'm going to get to the peacekeeping mission in just a moment, but Dr. Makhubela, perhaps let's start with someone who's asking right now, and just for some clarity, what is the genesis of what we're seeing in the Eastern DRC?
It's the failure of the inter-Congolese process and different processes that unfolded, including the Pretoria Accord, which essentially was setting up clear parameters for the resolution of the Congolese conflict, which was signed by President Kagame and the then president of Uganda. It's the DRC, I'm sorry. Yeah. But it spells out what needed to be done. So the failure to implement this peace process has led to where we are. And I still hold the view, Bongiwe, that the best way to resolve this is a political solution. And I'm really sorry that we're starting to see this kind of casualties from South Africa, and our condolences and our hearts goes to families of the soldiers. But it's something that we could have avoided if we look at resolving this politically.
I'm going to get to the Sun City Agreement in just a moment as well, because former President Thabo Mbeki has been speaking about it in recent times as well. But Sophie, when you look at what we are seeing playing out there, you do have people right now who are asking questions as to why are the SANDF members even in the Eastern DRC to begin with, because other people simply not aware as to how we got to this point.
Well, I think post-1994, starting with former President, or the late President Nelson Mandela, he implemented a foreign policy anchored around a peaceful Africa and a peaceful world, because ANC came to a conclusion that that has been the founding principle of the African National Congress. The African Native Congress, Kingsley Isaiah called for the unity and the peace of the African continent. And therefore, based on how Africa supported the Liberation Organization also, I think the government then decided that we are going to ensure that our foreign policy is anchored around that. I think Professor, because he's a former ambassador, he's a diplomat, has even a better explanation in terms of how our foreign policy was crafted. And therefore, all along the argument has always been, if you don't have a peaceful SADC, if you don't have a peaceful Africa, if you don't have a peaceful world, your own country will not be at peace.
Dr. Cilliers, I'm going to bring you in just a moment, but let me come back to you right on that point, as to say, if you don't have a peaceful SADC, there could be serious implications here. But others are saying that it seems that, you know, South Africa may have gone into this ill-prepared. It should not have even gotten to that point where we see our own troops then being deployed to that part of the Eastern DRC. What do you say to someone who has that argument?
Well, Sophie is quite correct. You know, the basis of the South African foreign policy is the consolidation of the African agenda. And at the core of that is a resolution of the conflict within the continent. I think the policy is quite correct. But so, I think there's been failure in terms of government communication. We're not learning from other countries. You know, when the Americans went to war in Iraq, they sold the idea that Saddam Hussein had weapons of mass destruction, and people bought into that. When we send our troops to the DRC, did we really explain to the public? Because we should have understood at that stage that there will be a day, because in any war, you have to have casualties. There will be a day that will bring back casualties back home. And that would have helped, people wouldn't be asking this question as to why our soldiers doing, to rally behind the president and the soldiers and those casualties and families of them. Not raising these questions. Really, some people are saying South Africa must withdraw and so on. It shows a lack of understanding about the strategic nature of the South African diplomat. That should have been done at that stage.
You have this graphic that we've got on screen right now. If you can keep it up as I bring you in, Dr. Cilliers, because you've got some, you've got MONUSCO, you've got the Force Intervention Brigade, you then have SADC, and some of the people are looking at what has been said. For example, if you think about MONUSCO and some of the criticism that has been leveled against it, even on the ground, by others who are saying it hasn't achieved what it needed to achieve. Let's speak about what does a peacekeeping mission entail? What does it look like?
Well, I think the situation in the Eastern DRC is unchanged for more than a decade. In the meanwhile, so the United Nations had a very large peacekeeping mission in the DRC, eventually deployed in the Eastern DRC, and that eventually was asked to withdraw and is scaling down. That has now been replaced by much smaller forces. First, well, amongst others from East African community, now from SADC, who don't have the equipment or the resources. So it's very nice to talk about South Africa's ambitions on peacemaking on the continent. But there is very little evidence of that in reality. We can look at Sudan, we can look at Mozambique. And in this instance, in the DRC, South Africa just doesn't have the means anymore to deploy significant forces. It doesn't. It's got an offensive mandate in the DRC, and it is very clear that the M23 is overrunning the South Africans because they don't have the capacity, they don't have the logistics, they don't have the firepower to resist this. So it does call for a political process, and now we see a political process both in South Africa, SADC, and the East African community, and there have been many before that. Yeah. But the root causes of the problem is not being addressed, and those root causes relate to the nature of the Rwandan government, which we need to remember in this part of the world is a minority Tutsi government, which is very fearful of what's happening with the former Hutu extremists that have fled into the eastern part of the DRC. And then there are the economic and the other interests that mean that the DRC and Rwanda are intimately linked. And the hostility in the region on top of that.
Dr. Cilliers, I'm going to bring that into the discussion just in a short while, but I want to stay with something that you said. You say that they have an offensive mandate, but we hear from, for example, earlier on, the ANC Secretary General Fikile Mbalula saying that the Defense Department will brief the media tomorrow, but he says that they're not at war, they're not there on an offensive, they're there on a peacekeeping mission, repeating it repeatedly. You have others who are saying that they're not on an offensive mandate. You say they are.
Yes, they are. Yeah. It seems like, for example, that what has happened recently was part of an initial effort to drive the M23 and to halt their offensive. And then there was a firefight between the armed forces of the DRC and the M23, in which so-called friendly fire landed on the South African base. Yeah. It is very evident that this is a hot war. This is not a traditional peacekeeping mission, and I think we kid ourselves if we try and make this out that this is somehow that there's a peace between Rwanda and the DRC and that we are somehow placed in the middle to try and resolve this. This is an unfortunate situation that I think the SANDF finds itself in, and it doesn't have the means to really to be able to defend itself.
Let me bring in Sophie here before I take that graphic that looks at Goma, because I want us to talk about its significance and some of the underlying dynamics that could be at play there. Sophie?
I want us to go to the graphics. You have MONUSCO, you have Intervention Force, you have the SADC now. The Intervention Force, a decision was taken when MONUSCO, which is mandated to keep peacekeeping, couldn't do much when citizens were being killed. And therefore a decision was taken to make another input in terms of ensuring you have force intervention brigade. And South Africa at some point in time was part of that. So it's not true that I agree with my colleague here that it's not about only peacekeeping, because peacekeeping you can't fight. Secondly, when you look at the mandate of the SADC now, I think that's where the problem is. This mandate was bound to lead to the current challenges, because it says you have to fight side by side, support the DRC forces. Now, the problem with the DRC forces, it has got support of the rebel group, the people, the so-called genocidaires, who killed the Tutsis in the DRC, who fled in Rwanda, who fled to the DRC. So this issue of using mercenaries and rebels as a government, you will end up having a problem. So that mandate creates space for other people to come and say, we will back the M23 rebels.
If we can bring up that graphic that looks at Goma particularly as a place, you know, in and itself, because the significance of its positioning as well as the significance of it just as a place there as well is also quite critical, especially when you look at what is taking place there. You do then have, you know, its positioning. If we do have that map there, if we're able to see it there, you can see on the screen. Look at Goma and where it's situated quite closely to Rwanda. And then you look at how far Kinshasa is, Dr. Makhubela. And a lot of people have been talking about this particular map to say that if you see just how close Goma is, but also look at what is currently taking place there. If we can put up that graphic that looks at the mining in North Kivu when it comes to the activity there, speaking about the, you know, just the interest that may also be underlying there. You're looking at gold, you're looking at coltan, diamonds, etc. How much of what we're seeing there, in your view, Dr. Makhubela, could also be linked to what is on screen now?
You know, on the mission, the purpose of the mission, it was the Security Council of the United Nations. The UN mission and subsequently the SADC mission operates under Chapter 7, which is peace enforcement, which it's an offensive one. I just want to confirm what Sophie and Jack were saying earlier on. But you know, the whole concept of war economy, it's what it's prevailing in Goma, because the war economy is benefiting people who are operating outside the state system. They're not paying taxes, they're able to sell the goods, they're able to procure this. So the criminal syndicates have taken hold of that, and it makes it very difficult. I think there's a lot of literature around the war economy and how to stop that. But having said that, there are decisions that were taken. And I mean, when I was at DECO, we trained South Africa. We trained the Rwandese pilots were trained here in South Africa. The students were trained here in most of our universities. So good relations between South Africa and Rwanda. And I still find it difficult up to date that the Rwandese who go into combat with South Africans, who train them actually, build their institutional capacity to self-defend themselves. Where did everything go wrong? Of course, we always say the breakdown of war, it means the failure of diplomacy. So we need to go back to the drawing board and find a diplomatic solution to the conflict. And if you look at Goma, as you are saying, it's actually much closer to Rwanda than to the DRC. And it's the whole intricate problem which was recognized during the inter-Congolese dialogue, that the question of ethnicity around the area, it's the most problematic issue that needs to be resolved. Who is a citizen of the DRC?
I'm going to come back to that diplomatic solution and what it looks like, because remember that Sun City agreement was seen as a panacea, for example, to resolving some of what was taking place. Then you have former President Thabo Mbeki who's saying that you should disarm the genocidal forces and implement what was taken in terms of agreements at Sun City. But we're going to talk about that in just a moment. I'm going to come to you, Dr. Cilliers. When you look at the positioning of Goma itself and what is taking place there, and as we've just heard now, as far as the syndicates are concerned, in your view, how much, when we are looking at the situation that is currently unfolding there, is also, in fact, complicated by the fact that you do then have this economy, this war economy, that is also raging?
So the economy of the Eastern DRC is part of the Rwandese economy, to a large extent. The people that are mostly profiting from the instability in the Eastern DRC are not criminal syndicates, it's the government of Rwanda. Because the minerals that are being exported, that are mined, if you only look at the export composition of the Rwandan economy, you'll see that they don't have their own gold or coltan, but they export huge quantities. Where does that come from? It comes from the Eastern DRC. It's an organized I wouldn't say a criminal enterprise, but it's part of how Rwanda is funding, particularly its war effort in the Eastern DRC, but the Rwandan economy. But that's not where the problem started. The problem started, as you and others have indicated, of course, with the genocide in Rwanda, when the Hutus were driven out by Paul Kagame, fled into the Eastern DRC. So the problem started with a real and a legitimate security threat from the Eastern DRC on Kagame, who still leads largely a Tutsi government. Over time, this has changed. And as you have pointed out, the economic interests by the Rwanda are now becoming predominant. And then you have the problems that there are with regard to the legitimacy and acceptance in the Eastern DRC of the Kinshasa government, which you have referred to. It's a complicated issue, and I don't think that diplomacy is easily going to resolve this. We must remember there's been a Nairobi peace process. There has been the Luanda peace process. There has been Sun City, and you can go back. And we will have any number of summits now from SADC and from the East African Community. East EAC summit happens tomorrow. I don't see how talking is, without a real commitment from President Kagame, is going to resolve this. President Kagame is really at the heart of the challenges here, and he feels beleaguered. And Rwanda acts like the old Sparta in Greece. It sees itself as a muscle-bound state that does very well, but that exports, well, in this instance, insecurity, and sees itself as a provider of security, both in northern Mozambique and elsewhere on the continent. So it's a difficult situation that is going to require a response particularly by President Kagame.
And I want to know from you, Dr. Makhubela, who needs to be at the table. But before we do that, Sophie, Dr. Cilliers speaks about the EAC. We're thinking about Kenyan President William Ruto, who has faced a bit of a backlash because not everybody is happy with the disclosure that he's briefed the French president about what is taking place in the Eastern DRC.
It goes back to what we spoke about, the genocide. You know that in 1994, Belgium and France were fingered in that genocide. So when you are a head of state, you don't call your peers in the region, in the Great Lakes region, or at least someone on the continent. You call France. France is losing influence in West Africa. What are you communicating? You call America. Fortunately, during the sitting of the Security Council, America was neutral, while Russia said, this problem, you can't forget the colonial past. That speaks to the genocide as well. So I think that's why people were saying, hang on, African solution by Africans. You are saying African solution by, if at least he had said, I didn't even hear him say, I've called President Ramaphosa, who has lost 9 soldiers, or Malawi. You stand there, you are proud, I have engaged Macron.
And Sophie, when you then look at South Africans who are saying that, why do you still have SANDF members there? Can they come back home? And some of the, them not even understanding the complexity of the fact that if there's a SADC extraordinary session that is going to decide on what needs to happen, if you then have these particular, countries agree, it's not just as simple as saying, come back home tomorrow.
You can't do that at this moment. And I think the issue of security, you are going to leave a vacuum. Anarchy is going to prevail. You have to find a way, an exit, or perhaps, as the president has indicated in his discussion with Paul Kagame, they've both agreed that there should be cessation of hostilities. And you had my colleague saying that Paul Kagame is very important. And if you are able to find a way to manage Paul Kagame, not badly so, but in terms of he must understand and support what needs to happen, even including during negotiations, you'll get it right. So I think last year I spoke to Paul Kagame about these issues, and President Ramaphosa spoke to him in Kigali. President Mbeki spoke to President Ramaphosa, and I think you have to talk and you can speak to those people who have been there, who understand it, and I think the two guests know better in terms of this because they've been there.
Dr. Makhubela, when you talk about this diplomatic solution, yesterday, former DIRCO Minister Dr. Naledi Pandor also spoke about this diplomatic solution. What does it look like? Who is at the table this time around?
Thank you, Bongiwe. The diplomatic approach is continuous negotiation. That's the meaning of diplomacy. And I just want to say to Jack, diplomacy is negotiations, and there has to be a negotiated settlement out of this. There must be a willingness to address the legitimate concern of the Rwandese, that the Interahamwe, the FAR and the FDLR elements that are operating there and training to prepare for the attack or perceived attack against the Rwandese, those issues must be addressed. And they are contained in the Pretoria Declaration of 2002. That's why the Rwandese withdrew 20,000 troops in 2002 with the hope that the Interahamwe and all these elements that were involved in genocide will be confined and controlled within the DRC. We all know that the DRC has lost control of its state. It's basically, the DRC is a state failure. So there must be some level of intervention. Rwanda must be involved, must be at the table. And I think President Tshisekedi must be willing to negotiate also with the M23, because they're an integral part of the problem. If you don't talk to them when they're a problem, who are you going to talk to? You always talk to your enemies, you don't talk to your friends, and you bring your enemies to the table to address their concerns and address those concerns.
In your view, as someone who's been also watching this, you know, this space over time, would you say that, especially when Yaki talks about this perceived threat, right, and you take it back to 94, what we saw that taking place in Rwanda, is this perceived threat still as high as it was, especially when it comes to what former President Thabo Mbeki is talking about around disarming the genocidal forces? Is that threat still real for Rwanda right now?
The threat, Bongiwe, it's still there because these people are trained and they are still there. But the biggest problem also is the integration of the M23 into the DRC. Part of the agreement that were made was that all military formation will be integrated in the new DRC army, so they haven't been integrated. If you leave armed groups outside the integration, that's where the problem is. So they must bring them in and include them in. So that's so crucial. It's so crucial. It has been recognized actually during the inter-Congolese dialogue that the question of ethnicity is something that must be addressed, and the whole integration of the public. I'm not sure about, Bongiwe, the discussion about the truth and reconciliation. Reconciliation is very important, but the element of truth in a country that has endured so many conflicts, very intractable conflict, it will mean at the end that those who are involved in the conflict, they must go and tell the truth, and they won't be able to support a system that is going to root them out. So there must be some innovation to deal with this issue outside allowing impunity, as the inter-Congolese dialogue clearly made it quite
an interesting one. Dr. Cilliers, we're hearing that the Department of Defense will brief the media tomorrow. What do they say?
Yes, well, I think that's we have a South African National Defence Force that is completely overstretched, underfunded, and that is struggling. And we are using the Defence Force inappropriately. We have troops in northern Mozambique, in the DRC. We can't support any of them. I think it's really time, and many of us have called for this over many years, that we reconfigure the South African National Defence Force in line with our available budget. We don't have aircraft to support them. We don't have evacuation of casualties. We can't provide them with the logistics that is required. It is a dire situation. Our men are dying. They are dying because we are unable to support them. We give them a mandate, an offensive mandate, to go and provide security, and we say to them, you just got to do this. We can't provide you with the means to do this. This is an unacceptable situation where our troops are left to die. And I don't think that is acceptable in South Africa. We really need to reconfigure and rethink when we send our troops on these kind of missions, we can't support them in the Eastern DRC anymore. We could do that 10, 15 years ago. We can't do it anymore.
And yeah, one wonders then if the pages of the Defence Review are just sitting there gathering dust, because what you've had to say is something that has been
document.
There. It's really been there.
Meaningless document.
Yeah, it's really been there, and it speaks about some of the ambitions that South Africa has. But let me thank you all for your time. Certainly a big big story this is, and it's going to be for quite some time, given the fact that right now these tensions continue to escalate, and we are waiting then to hear what the Department of Defence then has to say and give us an update on what's happening there. That's Dr. Kingsley Makhubela, risk analyst and former diplomat. Dr. Cilliers, board chair and head of African Futures and Innovation at the Institute for Security Studies. Also SABC News International editor Sophie joining us in conversation. Thank you so much for that.